Hello again. A number of people commenting on this channel have asked why I've said nothing about the kingdom of Aksum, which flourished in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea in the early centuries of the Common Era. There's a reason I've avoided this subject, and that is because I fear that my views are going to irritate and antagonise people. But never mind, I've been asked to talk about it, and so I shall. The thesis has been advanced that Aksum was an indigenous African civilization whose existence proves that Africans were just as capable as the Romans and Greeks of forging a mighty empire without any outside help. The evidence suggests otherwise. Here's some traces of Aksum, and they're certainly impressive. We must realise to begin with that there's nothing at all dubious about the idea that a sophisticated culture existed in that part of East Africa between 2000 and 1200 years ago. In the description of this video there's a link to an article from the British magazine New Scientist about archaeological excavations in Ethiopia. It was published last year. It's not behind a paywall or anything, anybody can see it. These excavations were at a place called, well, the researchers called it Beta Samati, which in the local language, Tigrinya, means house of audience. Right there is a very strong clue to the true origins of Aksum, because although I can't speak a single word of Tigrinya, I can understand that Beta Samati means house of audience. How come? Let me explain. I lived for some years in Israel and consequently speak Hebrew. In Hebrew, house is bayet and house of is bet. Here is shomer, yeah, here. And the past tense, as in I heard, is shamati. So in Tigrinya, Beta Samati means house of hearing, house of audience, and it's cognate with the Hebrew, Bet Shamati. It's similar to the Arabic, and there's another clue there because the Arabic word for hear, smer, is similar to the Hebrew, but it lacks the sh sound, the sh sound. So in other words, Tigrinya and Arabic have more in common than Tigrinya and Hebrew. This brings me to an interesting point. If you ask most people about the languages of Ethiopia, anyone that knows about the country will have heard of Amharic, and the chances are they'll say, oh yes, they speak Amharic in Ethiopia. Some have heard of Tigrinya, they'll mention that as well. Here's a curious thing. Fewer than 30% of the people in Ethiopia speak Amharic. It's a minority language. The most common language in that country is Oromo, which is a African language with a lot of speakers, along with Arabic, Hausa and Kiswahili. Oromo has got more speakers than any other African language. However, Oromo is an African language, and because of this in Ethiopia it's regarded as being of low status. Most educated Ethiopians don't think much of African languages. The high status language, a language of prestige and power, politics and influence, is of course Amharic, which is a Semitic language, like Hebrew. It's written in an ancient script, which is also Semitic. It didn't have its origin in Africa at all. The Amharic and the alphabet that it uses came Semitic, they're like Arabic and Hebrew. Here's some inscriptions. People generally adopt foreign languages and so on, using them for high status stuff like politics and education. When a conqueror or coloniser has occupied their land and made it clear that theirs is a language you must speak if you want to get on. You see this in North Africa with Arabic, which of course is the language of the conqueror. We saw it in Europe with Latin, which again was the language of the conqueror. The culture and civilization of Aksum was not an indigenous African civilization at all. It's, if it were, then African languages would be the languages of power rather than Semitic ones. What actually happened is that Semites from Yemen and southern Arabia came to that part of Africa and colonized some areas in what is now Eritrea and Ethiopia. Ultimately, they founded a realm there. They crossed over Bab el-Mandeb, it's a strait at the mouth of the Red Sea. All this was centuries before the birth of Jesus. They imposed their own language and culture upon the black Africans who were living there. Aksum was a colonial enterprise by Semites. Quite apart from the fact that all the inscriptions in Ethiopia and Eritrea from Aksum are in a Semitic language and written in a Semitic script, there's also the evidence of DNA, specifically DNA from southern Arabia. This is found very commonly in speakers of Amharic and Tigrinya, but hardly at all in speakers of Oromo, which suggests that possibly we see the remnants of a Semitic elite or ruling class who intermarried with the native population thousands of years ago. Working on that hypothesis, it's not too difficult to figure out what happened. Over 2,000 years ago, people from southern Arabia sailed across the Bab el-Mandeb and they settled in what is now Ethiopia. They brought their language and culture and passed it on to those living there. They eventually founded a kingdom. The Semites they formed an elite. They were the rulers. Their language was the important language. This is the same process by which Britain was colonised by Italy a couple of thousand years ago, of course. And just as in Ethiopia, the language of the inhabitants was not so important. It was the language of the conquerors that people had to learn to get on, which in the case of the Italians that came to colonise Britain was, of course, Latin. That's why until a few years ago, Latin was the language of the church in this country, in Britain. Services were held in Latin. It's the same reason why a Semitic language rather than an African one is used today in Ethiopian church services. I've put a link in the description, well actually I have not put a reference in the description of this video to some of the DNA research if people want to check that out for themselves. Let me just sum up what I've been saying. Educated Amharic and Tigrinya speakers in Ethiopia look with disdain upon those of African origin, those who speak African languages like Oromo. Now, I've advanced a possible explanation for this attitude. Those that disagree with what I've said can now put forward their own explanation. It's no good just barking white supremacist or something. That won't answer at all. I'm assuming that those that comment on this subject have discussed language with Ethiopians, obviously, so that they know for themselves what I'm talking about here.